Greetings all. Welcome to another session here at Tuesday Talks. This is our last in a long series of discussions on the history of the English language. And today we're going to be talking about English among the other languages. We began way back when English was not really even established and how it emerged out of a variety of different languages. And now we're here as English has grown into a powerhouse. And we're going to talk about how English continues to grow through, through new innovations, through interactions with other cultures, and to see how this is playing out. And then we'll take a look at a little video that's on YouTube regarding the future of society and the future of English. Let's jump right in here to our introduction. And this is Bailey who is talking. He's basically saying that heightened social values accrued around the possession of having more than one language. At some point in the evolution of the English language, there was a desire among some to have people within the culture who were multilingual, people who could be go-between, as it were. That was true of the early 1900s. It's also true today with our society. As you see within our society today in 2010 and decade, you see that there is a need for people to know, for example, in the United States, English and Spanish. There's also a large influx of Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and, of course, many other languages. Earlier in the century, there are certainly places in the United States where only knowing one language was certainly doable. But now today, people who are multilingual are seen to be have more capabilities, more possibilities. In truth, when you look at the statistics for people who are multilingual in school, they typically do better on SAT tests. They typically do better overall as far as language is concerned, provided that their multilingualism includes English as one of its primary languages. But there is evidence to say about that. Why was this diversity of language considered normal? Well, in Europe or in England, Great Britain, there were languages all over the place. If you look at Europe and the countries' sizes and their proximity to one another, it's very common because of its closeness, because of the relationships that are all there. It's very common for people in those countries to have multiple languages. So again, they can traverse borders and interact with people. So it was considered a good thing. Again, in the United States, it was less so because there was so much space involved with only one language. Bailey goes on to say, a country united in language and customs is fragile and weak. I take disagreement with him within this field. I look, for example, at countries like China or Japan. Prior to World War II, Japan was, they were the island, of the rising sun. They were all alone. That was the only language that was spoken in their area. They had a very strong and growing culture. So I don't see how this was quote-unquote fragile or weak. China, you could say the same thing. Even in Korea, the primary language is Korean. Now, obviously, they've grown tremendously post-war. And so they have a lot of international work that's going on there, but they are primarily a one culture, one language society as well. So I know that I would disagree with this whole idea that it's fragile and weak. Certainly the growth of language is going to be encouraged by having multiple access, multiple interactions with language groups from other cultures, from other languages. So people at the crossroads of language and culture, they create the new language. And I don't deny that. That would be true. But that doesn't mean that a monolithic society is in some way weak or fragile. Not necessarily true. Now, when the English language began to grow, and especially with the conquest and the exploration of places like India and Australia and the Americas and Canada, as you saw this expansion all over the place, people began to need ways to interact with people. So they needed people who could assist them in this boundary. They needed a translator. They needed some way to borrow words from others. They needed to create new words because they were going into a new area, a new situation. You can see this in the past as well. If you look at the word London, for example, from the Londinium, which was a Latin word, and that actually came from Londinos, which was Celtic. Okay, so we have this translation of words. They're borrowed from another language. We have a translator, okay, or a Wistod, who was basically a mediator. King Oswald was a bilingual in Gaelic and Northumbrian, which probably had tremendous benefit during his time because he could communicate with two different groups. One that was clearly a separate group altogether, and so it was a benefit to him to have that. It was to his advantage. English during Old and Middle English times was looked down upon. Slowly it began to gain favor, okay, and then of course as conquest began, exploration began, and wars with France and Spain ended with the victor being England. Great Britain continued to gain dominance and force. The business sector as well helped to make English become a more dominant force in the world. Now let's go look at some of the adventurers. Actually, we won't look at the adventurers. We'll look at some of the ways that language began to grow. These encounters as these people, these adventurers, moved out into new places. As merchants moved into new parts of the world, whether it was India or Africa or the Americas, and they moved out into those areas, they encountered people and they needed to communicate with them. They reach out and they intersect with other cultures and languages. And that was a good thing. On the mainland, however, there was more and more of an interest. Not more and more. Let me take that back. There was interest within a certain group of people to want to restrict and control language. Way back in the 1360s, the English who were living in Ireland were forbidden to speak Gaelic. It was against the law for them to do that. In 1536, 200 years later, Welsh speakers were expelled from powers of position. If you spoke Welsh in a political position, you were kicked out. Okay, Cornish speakers were forced to become Protestants, and this was after Henry VIII created Protestantism in England. In the 1600s, children were required to be schooled in English. Had never been that way before. In the United States, even children are required to be taught in English for the most part. There are some places where bilingualism is accepted. There are benefits to this, and then, of course, there are drawbacks to it. The biggest benefit being that you'll be able to more effectively, more successfully integrate within the larger society, within the more dominant society. But you may also lose things from the more minor society. What happens with the English language is because it becomes so strong, so powerful, that it actually begins to overwhelm the other languages, Latin and French in particular. And if you look in languages around the world, there are many, many words from English that are imported into those other languages. There are very few words that are imported from the minor language into the major language. And I can see that today, even as I was living overseas in Japan. There are very few quote-unquote Japanese words, one or two or three that I can think of. But on the flip side, if you look at English words that have been imported into Japanese, there are many, many words that have been brought in. The more dominant one begins to overwhelm the less dominant one. Now, it goes in stages, mind you, but and it goes at certain levels. It doesn't go in very deeply, but vocabulary in particular does have an impact. Caxton and his printing also did significant strength to the English language. He strengthened what was going on because he was printing in English. He was printing a variety of books that were printed in other languages first. He'd print them in English. Another benefit was the birth of new typefaces. Originally, languages were printed in a few typefaces, but later on, typefaces like Greek and Hebrew were added, which allowed for more interaction with those languages. So printing also had a big effect on what was going on with the birth and dissemination, the strength of English. Now, English out and about. During the exploration and conquest, English runs into other peoples and their languages, which resulted in acquiring exotic words, words that we didn't necessarily have in the original language. So we borrowed words from the Spanish or from the Portuguese or from Native American Indians, words like chocolate or potato or tomato or popcorn. These are words that we appropriated or we made up as we ran into new things, and we borrowed from other languages. We still do that, although not as much as we did in the past. In the past also we had go-betweens, very important. People like Pocahontas, who won't be listed here, but someone who knew multiple languages, and they used them to be a guide so that they could communicate with whoever they were going to be running into. John Hawkins is another example. He took the plunder from Spanish ships. He figured it was easier than getting treasure from the New World. And so he would interact with them. Obviously, he would want to know some Spanish. He was a go-between. David Ingram, one of the sailors during this time, he was abandoned in America. Literally, he was abandoned in the southern part of America. He traveled the height of the country. How long do you think that took on foot or horse? He traveled the height of the country until he got get to the north and reach a French regiment, a French group of explorers/soldiers, and from there hitched a ride back to England. In addition, he learned many different languages and cultures there, including French, and he came back to the Americas and he was a translator. He became a go-between. Thomas Harriot was a bilingual in English and Algonquin, and so he could work between the Indians and the English. Thomas Harriot. There were other go-betweens. The Portuguese actually exiled a man in West Africa, and they had a couple of kids while they were in West Africa. They became go-betweens. The children spoke both languages. 1536, Jacques Cartier left 2 boys behind in St. Lawrence. I believe they did it deliberately, and the boys survived, and they became translators when the ships came back. But they could do that because they lived there and they learned the language. Not an easy way to do it, by the way. Certainly far different from the way of learning language today. 1613, East India Company thought that they had a way of developing good translators. They kidnapped people from the Cape of Good Hope, and they wanted to train them as translators. Their results, unfortunately, were dismal, maybe fortunately. People were so distraught, so upset, so shocked at the foreign influence. Okay, these were older people that they kidnapped, and so they couldn't be useful at all. 1621. Tisquantum was a native of Massachusetts, and he was kidnapped by the English. He was sold as a slave to the Spanish. Somehow he got to England, he was freed and returned to New England, and he became a translator. Throughout all that struggle and whatnot, he became a go-between because he knew languages. In the month of March, we also celebrate an interesting man who ended up being a missionary, and that was Saint Patrick, who was also kidnapped and made a slave for many years, servant in Ireland, and he eventually escapes Ireland, goes back and becomes a bishop, and eventually becomes a missionary and goes back. He's a go-between. There were other missionary translators in the United States, like Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, and he learned several local languages. He shared the gospel with the Indians there, and he even published a few books in their language. Lastly, John Eliot, he learned Algonquin, and he translated the Bible in Algonquin for the Indians who lived there. So we needed translators. We needed go-betweens. If you're interested in learning to be a translator or a go-between, highly recommend you look up SIL and try to learn more about language and how it's learned so that you can become a more successful translator. English expands. Learning English began to become fashionable because it was more popular, because it was used in many, many places. Some people began to say that English was destined to become the lingua franca. Lingua franca is, of course, a French word, meaning the language of the French, but it also meant the language of the common people, the main language everywhere. And it began to become that way. In the Americas, in England, obviously, in India, in Australia, in Canada, English was pretty much many places. The place that it wasn't was in the old country, in Europe. But because there were so many merchants who were interested in interacting with all of these places where English was spoken, English grew stronger. It did become this global language. They also stressed a resistance to multilingualism. No matter where you go, there's going to be a group of people who say, we want to protect our language. Whether that can be done politically or legally, I do not know. Something tells me no. All those other languages are going to be there, even if you try to impose it. But people have been trying to do it. A change in the expansion from adventurers to merchants. After the adventurers arrived and they set up a place, merchants began to come in, and they were bringing their own brand of English. They were also bringing their own brand of borrowing, their own brand of translators. It was more refined. It was more detailed. It was more set to their business. And so they were trying to learn ways to communicate, to buy and sell. Merchants like their merchant words, and they want to try to use words for them. It becomes more specialized. So does the writing style. It becomes less formal in the hopes of trying to gain opportunity for buying and selling. In different worlds, you're going to have different languages. In the merchant world, especially at the beginning, they were more concerned about getting their point across and less concerned about the formality of writing. Now, new words were coming into play here, and a lot of it had to do with the technology. We spoke about this before. The introduction of the telegram was a primary way we would communicate, but every letter counted, every letter cost. It was harder to communicate that way, so people began to make smaller words. Again, we do this in chatting all the time. We try to create smaller words. And so technology is going to impact the way we communicate. Just like it is today with email and with and chatting, text messaging, the way that we're communicating is going to impact how we communicate, how it's going to impact language. I find interesting is that there are many words now that are embedded in text messages that are now coming out into normal, quote-unquote, normal standard communication. So, for example, there are people who will say lol, LOL, as opposed to laugh out loud, as opposed to saying that was funny. They'll use something that's pulled out of text messages. TTYL, talk to you later. People may say that now, as opposed to saying the entire phrase. They'll just say TTYL. All right, let's move on to how English also impacted science. Okay, as English people explored the New World, they began to investigate and introduce new worlds because of the environment that they were, the physical environment that they were in. In 1681, Robert Knox was somehow detained in Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And he learned Sinhalese, and he investigated the biosphere there, and he also brought home a lot of things after he was released. And because of all the interesting things that he discovered and wrote, began a new investigation into anthropology, who these people were in Ceylon, also geography, also in plants and animals. So science began to explode simply because the merchants and the adventurers happened to be somewhere, and they began to investigate. If you had taken notice of the movie Master and Commander, in that movie there is a doctor, a physician, who also happens to be a naturist. And when he has the opportunity to go to the Galapagos, he goes there and he collects information and he collects data. Why? In the hopes of bringing it back. Okay, he's adding to the English strength in science. Okay, just an example. Thus begins a new investigation, right? They wanted to borrow words to increase the authenticity of these newly discovered words. They wanted to borrow words, but at the same time, they wanted to create unique words, and so that they could be remembered more. So some of the words were borrowed, but sometimes also new words were created. In truth, they wanted to avoid the problem of the robin issue. What I mean by robin is robin in England and robin in the United States are they're actually two different birds. So is it a linnet or is it a thrush? And we don't want to have a generic word. Let's make up a new word. Okay? People oftentimes want to use the same word over and over again. I mean, for example, where is the city of Lancaster? Well, the city of Lancaster is next to the city of York in England, right? But if you look at the United States, in nearly every state, there is a city of Lancaster. In the state of Ohio, there is the city of Miami. Huh? Yeah. In Ohio, there's a city called Miami. In Pennsylvania, there's a city called Berlin, and a city called California in Pennsylvania. And so oftentimes we take these words, we just simply reuse them again. The scientists didn't want to do that. They wanted to avoid confusion, so they started creating new words or borrowing words so that they could make things more understandable. Science also, again, they create something called the periodic table. You all know what the periodic table is, right? Yay, here's the periodic table. Now at the beginning we've got words that we can understand, words like hydrogen or I don't know what that one is, scandium. This is iron, right? And here we have nickel and zinc, right? These are all pretty much ones that we understood. These are older ones. As we get down to the newer ones, we have new words. Copernicanum, right? That's probably from Copernicus, right? Where's this ER? Maybe this is one of his, right? Erbium, I don't know who this is. But they just made up these words. Neodymium. They started making up words. They all end in IUM over here, right? Uranium, plutonium, there it is, Einsteinium. They're just making up words. They made up new words so that these things could be remembered. And they were new words that were made up, okay? The older entries are more English, okay? Things like zinc and copper and hydrogen and helium, right? The newer words were more unique. They were made-up words. The scientists wanted to avoid the ambiguity, so they were creating these new words. All well and good. Okay? It just grows the English language. They're not borrowing. They're creating new words based on things that they have either discovered or things that they have created. Okay? There's less borrowing going on in later years. Okay. The prescriptivists of the world unite. There is an interest in the correctness, continues to grow. As we move more and more forward into the use of the English language into the 20th and 21st centuries, there is this greater and greater desire to have things that are correct and proper. I'm certain that some of you are going to be, as you're listening to these videos, you're thinking to yourself, ain't a word. Ain't is not a word, whether you like it or not, because that's the way you were taught. That's the way you were brought up. That's the way your prescriptivist teachers told you. So be it. That trend is growing. And now there are some poets who thought that they should write only in English. Others started to embrace the different varieties of English that were out there, like Creole. You could bring in new words, right? There was New England, there was Atlantic Canada, right? These dialectal adoptions emerged from a belief that language and cultures are intricately linked. And Bailey mentions this, and I would have to agree. Language and culture are linked, so we can play with words. There are some books that I have read. One that I think his name was Dusseldorf, was the character in the book. And the first chapter is all in English. The second chapter is all in German. The third chapter is half and half. And eventually things become very, very convoluted because they're mixing up these languages. Obviously, you have to know both languages and understand a little bit about both cultures before you can really understand it. But we're mixing, we're merging. Why? Because both cultures are interacting. Davy Crockett is an American frontiersman. He was a character used as a way to mock the elite and the pretentious. Now, to be sure, the elite looked down on Davy Crockett, but people who wrote for the audience of Davy Crockett used him to look down on the elites. Again, he was a frontiersman. He was the guy who was out front. He's where new language was coming from. So we have these varieties of English, even though some didn't like it, even though the prescriptivists were there and didn't want to see this. In any event, because of the expansion of Great Britain, many believed that English was now going to be everywhere accessible, and English was the only language that you needed to know. You didn't need to find and understand a new language. You could just, go anywhere and use English. So they started to try to push their way through any culture, anytime, only knowing one language. Okay? After this time, fewer and fewer words were borrowed. More and more words were invented. Okay? And this happens in World War I, World War II, and following, where you see more and more people are saying, we are the dominant culture. We are the dominant language. Therefore, we're going to use our language. We're not going to move out. We're not going to try to adopt other people's stuff. For the most part, that's happening today. We are not borrowing as many words. We are creating of our own words. But there are times where we do borrow words from others. Now, before I end here, I did want to show you a little video on the impact of language and how it is changing the world and what will be happening in future because of language. Sit back and enjoy. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this last little session here of the history of the English language. If you do have any questions, you can certainly post comments below. If not, I do thank you for your time, and thank you for watching this series.